Greetings once again to the Pilgrim Church of Christ Auditorium class. This is Danny here, and continuing with our one-off lessons until the opportunity that we have to get back into the building and have more structured lessons. I hope that these are being of some benefit to you, and I know I've certainly enjoyed putting them together and putting them on Facebook for them to be viewed. We're continuing with the lesson that we started last week. I began last week with speaking about a recent purchase I was able to make due to an Amazon gift card that I had been given, and I used part of that funds, that balance, to purchase a new Bible, which is a journaling Bible, journal a word Bible technically. And for those who weren't here last week, or if you're not familiar with it, the journaling Bible is simply, has no bells and whistles. It's just strictly the Word, but it does have almost half a page, about a third of a page, I guess, of lined area in the margins there that can be used for journaling, making notes, outlines, whatever the case may be. And I have just, within the last couple of days, actually begun trying to transfer my margin notes and things that I have in my everyday Bible to this one for a little bit neater arrangement, and just to have something to back up as well. And as I was going through that, I ran across several passages that I had marked that either individuals had told me personally, or they had made a statement publicly that these particular passages struck them in a special way. Some might say they're favorite passages. I'm not going to take that upon myself to assume, but whatever the case may be, I was struck by the fact that I found over 25 of these, and I thought this would be just a good lesson just to pass along to let us know how some of our brothers and sisters see the scriptures and what means something to them, and hoping in doing this that you'll just maybe see the perspective that they were coming from, and maybe even reflect on some passages that really speak to you, and see where we go from there. Last week we looked at the ones that I had marked from the Old Testament, and this week we're going to pick up with the ones that are in the New Testament. We will begin with the Gospel of Mark, Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 31. This one is a particular interesting one. This passage was the passage, the text that was used when Jason Allison preached his first sermon at Pilgrim Church of Christ. That was on July the 10th of 1994. And he, in addition to being his first lesson, I have notes in that same passage that indicate that he has used, referred to that passage at least 3 other times in that I made note of anyway. But I thought you might find this interesting, the outline that Jason used for this passage, and see how this fits where our society is today. Pardon me. He had 4 points that point to 4 occasions when Jesus speaks to us. The passage, Mark 4:35 through 41, I failed to mention, is the account of when Jesus was in the boat with his apostles. A violent storm came up, frightened the apostles. Jesus was asleep. They woke him up and said, "Don't you care that we're going to perish?" And Jesus rebuked them for being lacking faith, and then he rebuked the wind. And so he said, "Peace, be still." So he spoke peace not only to the elements, but he spoke peace to his apostles. And by Mark recording it here, Jesus still speaks peace to us. But once again, listen to these 4 points Jason brought out and see how appropriate they are even today. He says that Jesus speaks peace, first of all, when we are afraid of our fate. Think about that one for a few minutes in the world we are living in now. Secondly, he said Jesus speaks peace when we are fighting with one another. Sad to say that we're seeing that in today's society. We're seeing it escalate. There's fighting among races. There's fighting among gender, there's fighting among nations, and unfortunately, and I think to God's dissatisfaction, there's fighting among members of the kingdom. Thirdly, he says Jesus speaks peace to us when we face things beyond our control. Another very appropriate thing to think about. We are facing so many things that are beyond our control. We as humans don't like to be under the impression that there are things happening that we can't control. Fourth and final, Jason's brought out that Jesus speaks peace when we are lacking in our faith. I pray that neither I nor any of us is lacking any in our faith, but when we see the world struggle, that should increase our faith, because we know, and we should let the world know, that there is no answer to the troubles that the world faces outside of God and his redeeming salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus. So that was our first passage from the New Testament. Our next one will be found in the Gospel of Luke. This is the 6th chapter and the 40th verse. The words of Jesus here, he says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher." This particular passage is one that I noted down, it's been 6 years ago. I was going to say recently. 6 years ago, when the elders and staff attended a program at Lipscomb entitled Envision. And this particular day that we attended, or the class at least that several of us attended, was taught by Earl Lavender, and he used this passage as his text, and he said he had adopted this passage as his daily mantra, however you want to pronounce it, that a disciple is not above his teacher. We are not above Jesus, our teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. We should strive to be as much like Christ as we can, as our church motto says, to be the arms of Christ. Our next New Testament passage that speaks to someone in particular is found in Acts chapter 16. It looks like I've lost my bookmarks. Bear with me while I get there. Acts chapter 16, verse 9. This is, of course, during the early days of the church, where we have recorded in the book of Acts the early steps, the early growth, the early reaching out of the church. And in Acts chapter 16 and verse 9, we have Paul in the midst of some of his traveling and preaching. We have this statement made about Paul. "And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia stood and pleaded with him, saying, 'Come over to Macedonia and help us.'" It's probably a passage that many of us have heard many times over the years, but only recently did I learn that this passage was very influential to a couple that we have really grown to love just recently in our church family, Ken and Rhonda Beaver. It was during their 10th wedding anniversary that they were called to investigate, to visit, to experience some mission work that was going on in Haiti. And they see this verse as having spoken to them, that the Haitian Christians were reaching out to them, saying, "Come over and help us." And any of us who know Ken and Rhonda know that they have certainly set their hearts, and their focus on helping the Christians in the ravished country of Haiti. Our next New Testament passage is taken from the book of Romans, the first of three that we'll find in Romans. This is Romans chapter 7, verses 15 through 24. Romans 7, 15 through 24. Paul writing to the Christians there in the capital of Rome, capital city of Italy rather, when Paul speaks about his dilemma. If you have been viewing the 4-week presentation on Wednesday nights on our Peak of the Week study online from Andy Stanley that he titled Free, you will know that he's used this passage quite a bit in his lessons regarding Paul's approach and explanation of this battle that we battle within this temporal world against Satan and his influence. Paul himself said this: "For what I am doing, I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I will not to do, I agree with the law that it is good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, nothing good dwells, for to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do, but the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. I find then a law that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. But I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" See, Paul was truly in a dilemma there. And as Andy Stanley has pointed out in his free series that we've been viewing on Peak of the Week, that we will all find ourselves in that dilemma. And but thankfully Paul applies or provides the answer there when he says it's all made possible through Jesus Christ to address this battle of wills, if you will, between the flesh and the spirit. That passage, if you haven't already guessed, those who have been in Pilgrim for a while, is one that was really a foundational passage, and continues to be a foundational passage for Bobby Chapman, not only in his personal life, but in his dealings with trying to address people that come to him to fight their addictions and their falling back into addictions on a regular basis. Our next passage, as I said, is another one still in Romans, moving a few chapters down in chapter 12, and we're going to look at the second verse of Romans chapter 12. The first verse is a very familiar verse from Paul to the Romans, but the second verse is the one we're going to focus on today. The second verse, Paul says, instructing his Roman Christian readers and believers, Paul says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." This passage is the foundational passage for the Re-Engage program that we have had going on through the last several years at Pilgrim. It started several years ago with the ministers and the staff and the elders and their families and deacons and their families participating. And once we participated and saw the true benefit of this program, we encouraged the rest of the congregation to participate and even put out the invitation to the community. We have seen several iterations of this study, the Re-Engage program. We have seen God heal broken individuals and broken marriages and broken families, and praise be to God for that. Thankful for the opportunity to present that, to continue to present that. Especially thankful for those that have taken on the tasks of being leaders of the different breakout groups over the years, and may God bless them for that. Moving on, our final New Testament passage, at least in the book of Romans, is found in Romans chapter 15, verse 20. Romans 15, verse 20. Oh, I got way off somehow. Let me catch up. Went to the wrong bookmark. Romans 15, verse 20 says, again, Paul speaking to the Christians at Rome, he says, "And so I have made it my aim to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build on another man's foundation." Paul is speaking here about he had personally taken the challenge to spread the gospel to distant locations where others had not gone and planted churches. As he stated there, for the fact he did not want to be seen as trying to build on someone else's foundational work and take credit for what they had done. Paul, of course, we know, did found several churches in several locations and was very instrumental in many coming to Christ. This passage, I have noted in my margin, is a favorite of Greg and Vicki Gann's son Jimmy and his wife Laura, and now their family, their youngsters, in their approach to evangelizing some of the remote areas of India. We know they spent several years there preaching, teaching, mentoring, and from the reports we received, they had been engaged in some very enduring relationships with some young people there that were taking to the gospel and were taking the challenge of carrying on locally there. And so, bless Jimmy and Laura for that work and for the impact they have had to follow Paul's footsteps and take the gospel to remote areas. As we leave the book of Romans, we go to another location, and this particular entry is very interesting. You've probably heard the expression used many times when someone talks about answering a challenge or answering a query or answering a situation with God's Word, and they say that they will give you book, chapter, and verse. That's an old phrase that we've heard over many years. Well, the next person that has an entry here, I actually have a book and a chapter and a verse from this individual. Beginning with the book. The book is the book of Ephesians, and I have notated in the introduction to the book of Ephesians in my Bible that this is this individual's go-to chapter. In fact, I can attest to that because a few years back, when we were still able to participate in our mission work in Central America, when we were going to the Dominican Republic, we had set up, in addition to our medical missions, in addition to our food distributions, in addition to our construction work, we also partnered with some of the local preachers there, and were able to set up daily Bible study classes. And I was privileged to participate with this individual in 4 days of studying the book of Ephesians. And I was very blessed with that participation, and especially participating in this individual. As far as a chapter from this same individual, that would be the 23rd Psalm. I know I probably don't have to read that, but I will, keeping with our approach here. 23rd Psalm. David, it's specifically ascribed to David as a psalm written by him, says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And finally, for this individual, we have an individual verse. And that verse, or a passage of verses, is Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 10. Once again, I should not have to point out to you what that passage is. That is part of the Sermon on the Mount, the part typically referred to as the Beatitudes, verses 3 through 10 of chapter 5, Matthew, the beginning of Matthew's record of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. I have actually participated in an auditorium class taught by this individual on the Beatitudes. And that's where I have listed in my margin the three passages that speak to him, book, chapter, and verse. And this individual, if you have not guessed already, is Bill Orange. Did an outstanding job teaching this as a ladder of progression that he saw in this presentation that Jesus presents of individuals who are to be considered blessed, extremely happy, according to the original language. And even though it's a paradoxical situation that is presented, Jesus still says they can be very happy because of the things that are promised to them. So there we have the book, Ephesians, the chapter, Psalm 23, and the verses, Matthew 5, 3 through 10, the Beatitudes, which speak expressly to Bill Orange. Let's move on to our next New Testament passage, and that's from the book of Colossians. Colossians chapter 2, verse 5, and just the first part of verse 5. My bookmarks are slipping down and I can't turn as quickly as I would like. Colossians chapter 2, verse 5. 5a is what I got listed. Paul, in writing to the Colossians, said as an encouragement to them, "For though I am absent in the flesh, yet I am with you in spirit." This particular passage has become a foundational premise to all of us who over the years have participated in our mission trips to various places, to Mexico, to Honduras, to Africa, to the Dominican Republic, to Haiti, to Guyana, just the many places that have gone, because one of the great blessings that has attended the participants in the mission trips has been what's become known as the prayer journal. This was initiated with our first trip to Mexico a couple of decades ago now. As a staff, basically Cindy Vick's institution of this, she put out a request for members of the church family who were not participating in the mission trip to submit their prayers on behalf of those who were participating. And these were combined with scripture passages, and along the way it became combined with notes from some of our younger members. And what has always impressed us on our mission trips is how applicable each night's prayer journal entry has been to that day's activities. Journal entries, prayers that were submitted weeks ahead of time on the night that they were read, spoke to us about God's awareness of what we had experienced that day, and that can only be God's involvement in that. And so that's why this passage means so much to us and others from this church family who have gone on mission trips, because for those who stay behind, We've always tried to impress upon them they were just as much a participant on this mission trips as the ones who actually went. Because, like Paul said, for though they were absent in the flesh, they were with us and with the others in spirit. Our next New Testament passage is taken from Paul's first letter to the church at Thessalonica, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 11, where Paul tells the Thessalonians, "Therefore comfort one another and edify one another, just as you also are doing." This is a little unusual passage that I've inserted here because I have noted in my margin that this is the passage that continues to be one that Jason Allison would use when he was teaching the little kids camp at Lylewood, when they were charged with writing a letter, writing a card back home. Many of us have seen those and read some of those that Jason has posted during his sermons down through the years, and I've got noted here that that's what Jason used as a encouragement in having the kids send those letters home. This passage where Paul encourages us as Christians to comfort one another and edify one another, just as we are doing. Our next passage is from another letter from Paul, and that would be 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. Paul, writing to a young man named Timothy, Paul had a very close, special relationship with Timothy. He referred to him many times as his son in the gospel. He encouraged him in many aspects regarding his maturation as a person and as a Christian. And one of those is in this verse here, chapter 1 and verse 7, where he wants to impart to Timothy this concept that, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." Another very appropriate passage for the times we live in. We need to remind ourselves daily that God has not given us a spirit of fear. No matter what we have to face in this life, we have been given by God a spirit of power and of love and of a sound mind. And we should use those spirits to encourage ourselves, encourage our personal families, encourage our church families, encourage whomever sees us as an inspiration or as encouragement or as a representative of God's family here on earth. That passage is associated with Christina Fields, the second of hers that we were included. The first one was back in the Old Testament. In fact, it was the first one, chapter Genesis. Moving on, our next one is taken from James, chapter 4, verse 17. Got a lot of margin notes in James. I'm interested to see how I'm able to arrange that when I get to my journaling Bible in that book. But anyway, James chapter 4, verse 17, the last verse of chapter 4, James says, "Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin." Another passage we're very familiar with. I have in my margin that Jason's mom, Miss Pat Allison, refers to this passage as the scariest verse in the Bible. God through James says, if we know to do good and we choose not to do it, that in God's sight is a sin. One of those famous sins of omission, joined companion with sins of commission. Scariest verse in the passage in the Bible, according to Jason's mom. Our next passage is next to the last passage, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 10. Peter, writing here in apparently in his later years, reflecting back upon his early life and his association with Jesus. And in closing his, very near closing his first letter, he says in verse 10, "But may the God of all grace, who called us according to his eternal glory by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you." I have marked in my margin that this passage is Keith Luttrell's rally verse. I think he pointed this out when he was one of our guest speakers in 2015 when we celebrated our church family's centennial, when we brought back the 4 previous ministers, most recent previous ministers from Pilgrim, on the succeeding Sundays. And during Keith's presentation that Sunday, he presented this verse as a rallying cry, because Peter is calling on God to perfect and establish and strengthen and settle us after we have suffered a while. Peter mentions several times in his writings about how we must suffer as Christians, and that we just need to face the fact we're going to do it. But we can rally around this idea that God still will perfect, complete, will establish, will strengthen, and settle us in spite of how much we have suffered in this world. And finally, our final New Testament passage that I have labeled as special to an individual is taken from the book of Revelation. Very interesting study we have had in this book over the last few years, more than once, led by James Allen, with some additional helpers as well on some occasions, in looking at the book of Revelation. Simple Revelation is the title, and attempting to simplify the message God was wanting to convey through that book. But in chapter 21 in verse 4, we have this passage. "And God will wipe away every tear from your eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, and there shall be no more pain, for the former things have all passed away." That's John's presentation of this little vignette that God, through Jesus, presented to him about what was in store for those who remain faithful to his kingdom. He said there would be no more sorrow, no crying, no more pain, no more death, because that place, that eternal resting place, will be sinless, and without sin there can be no tears, death, or pain. This final passage of our study,